good afternoon to all our attendees and to the panelists on this part 2 of our webinar series, Life Cycle, with Mills Reeve and JL Romanillos. Thank you for joining us. If it's anything like the last one, part 1, which was a fascinating discussion, I suspect this will be equally engaging and entertaining. We have a new and very interesting panel joining us today, and I will be introducing them to you very shortly. My name is Jose L Romanillos. I run an international agency looking after people, organizations in the world of sport, music and entertainment. And we also run a private members club called JL Privé, which runs events and provides work for some of our clients. So I'm here in Guernsey, in the library of my club base, and I'm very, very excited to be introducing to you the panel. Let me begin with Julian Moore. Julian, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
Julian is a specialist commercial sports lawyer at Mills Reeve, and he focuses in the worlds of media, data, sports rights. Having worked some time ago in Switzerland and Singapore, he's now been at Mills Reeve for quite a while, advising on all sorts of sporting activities, but in particular, various international sports events, which really interested me. That included the FIFA World Cups, the UCI Road World Championships, and even in the world of horse racing, he's advised on the Epsom Derby. So quite a mixed and very interesting area. So welcome to you, Julian. And Julian will be co-hosting the show with me. Following Julian, we'll be moving on to Hugo Schechter, who is the founder and managing director of an organization called the Player Care Group. Hello, Hugo, and welcome to you, sir.
Morning, thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Hugo started the Player Group after leaving West Ham United Football Club, and he was head of player care there from 2018 to 2020, brought in by West Ham to create a player care department from scratch. So that was quite an interesting and pretty demanding job that was, I'm sure. Before that, Hugo was at Southampton Football Club, with which I have a special affiliation, and he was their first player team liaison officer, setting up a player care offering, and helping to make Southampton Football Club a really strong club with some of the world's best footballing talent. Hugo's also been employed as team operations manager at Indy 11, which was a second division startup team in the US's NASL League. He's currently studying the Elite Athlete Wellbeing course, and that is at Loughborough University. He also has a Business of Sports admin degree from George Washington University. And while he was at university, Hugo earned footballing coaching badges, coaching both men and women. And he also worked with the Indianapolis 500 races, I believe. So, wow, that's quite a CV as well. Thank you for joining us.
No problem, thank you.
Philip Grindell, good day, sir.
Good afternoon.
Philip is the founder of Defuse Global. So Defuse is a global intelligence and threat management consultancy, which combines the best in protective intelligence with behavioral science, and it eliminates anxiety, fear, uncertainty that can be caused in the world of sports, celebrities, politicians, VIPs, the sort of fears that can be communicated in the world via abuse, threats, intimidation, targeting by individuals who are fixated on these people. Defuse's team of internationally acclaimed experts. So they've been trusted to look after and advise some of the world's top politicians and individuals. And Philip literally has breaking news in that he's just been appointed as the NFL's UK representative, leading on intelligence and investigations for all the UK and their European events. So congratulations, Philip, on that appointment. Well done. In fact, he was also involved with another story that we're all probably very familiar with, a sad one, which is the murder of Joe Cox, MP. He was the person brought in by the UK Parliament to set up and run a team that prevented further attacks, such attacks, as well as investigating the online abuse that is directed and was directed at British politicians. Before he was called in to serve in that Parliament project, Philip was serving as a Scotland Yard detective for the Metropolitan Police for, 30 years. That's quite a long time. And he also spent time seconded to the British intelligence on counter-terrorist investigations. So again, fascinating CV. I look forward to hearing from you shortly, Philip.
Thank you. Richard
Dawson-Gerrard is the last of our specialists on the panel, and Richard is also engaged as a lawyer, a partner at Mills Reeve. So good day to you, sir. Richard specializes in disputes and reputation management. That's his world. He's helped individuals and organizations deal with management of their reputation proactively in relation to press inquiries, bad news, online issues, defamation, privacy. Examples he's given to me include government work, entertainment, well-known business people. And this is often regarding articles that are proposed or being planned for the BBC, ITV, The Sun, Tortoise Media, institutions. And this is in respect of possible allegations which can have potentially damaging consequences if these stories get out and are published. And he's actively helped prevent and managed to get diluted somehow many of these stories and articles and features that could have impacted seriously on people's lives, their careers and their professions. So again, Richard, fascinating story. We probably need 2 hours for all this, but unfortunately we've got 1 hour. The show will be recorded, so people will have another go at it. If they were unable to attend, they will be able to see the show in its entirety. There is a Q&A section, so if you'd like to put any questions through as we go along, we'll try and field those questions for you as we go. If we can't, we will then get back to you afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton over to Julian. Julian, over to you, sir, and thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you for passing the baton. And first questions, I'm going to bring in Hugo in the first instance. I think it's fair to say, given everyone's backgrounds, particularly Philip and Richard's backgrounds, that this session will probably focus in part on reputation management, on personal brand building, and engaging with the public as an athlete or media personality. And I know that's something that you and I will be talking about at some point. But before we do that, why don't we just sort of start on a slightly more high level basis, and for you to kind of explain what you mean by the concept of player care, and also maybe explain, given that the work you've done with various high profile football clubs, why you think it's important for football clubs to worry about player care, especially given the kind of salaries that we know that some players, but even young players, are paid. Why shouldn't they be looking after themselves, and why do the clubs increasingly get involved?
Thanks, Julian. Thanks for having me on this really exciting panel. I think to look at what player care is, it's really difficult because every club has kind of evolved in its own way to have different responsibilities and different things. I mean, to kind of give some background, some of the things that I've overseen over the years is player relocation, which is fairly obvious, but also team operations, team scheduling, fan mail, signed items, player appearances, team bonding activities, all these kind of COVID restrictions, obviously, in the last year. So I think there's so much that kind of can be classed as player care, and Man City would have a very different model to Liverpool, to West Ham, to Southampton, to wherever. So I think there's not really a set definition. I try and see it as everything that's kind of not football or medical that surrounds the team, which is kind of the sort of snappiest way I think you can describe it. But it's interesting because, this has been kind of something that's been kind of either been a very side sort of venture for clubs. They've kind of got one person who's been doing it for 30 years or something like that. And even now, not all Premier League clubs have some player care in some guys. So I think what I'm saying to clubs right now is, you have all the financial responsibility for these players. You buy them for often tens of millions of pounds, if not more. You pay them hundreds of thousands of pounds a week. By not having the support structure to make sure they flourish in their new environment, you are opening yourself up to a massive financial risk. And I think because the football industry has so much money, it's often the case of, well, he hasn't worked out, let's get another striker in, or let's get another player in. Well, why not put even 1/10 of a week's salary into making sure that he's got everything he lives in? And I think if you look at, I think some of us have lived across the world, but I think if I moved from England to Senegal age 19, I would really struggle to know, how do you get a car? How do you get a bank account? How do you live? When do the bins go out? So why would we expect someone from Senegal to come to England age 19 and hit the ground running, and it be really obvious? And I think there's certain cultural nuances, but also just, how to get things done. It is really, really important that you have someone to guide them through it. But someone who's emotionally invested, often it's pointed, why aren't the agents doing this? Well, an agent wants a player to be probably 80% settled so that they play well, but they're open to a move to another club because that's when the agent gets paid often. So the clubs want a player to be 100% settled. So bring this service in-house, have it organized, have process driven, and then you as a club control this much better. And I think that's what I'm trying to get across to clubs, is that, you have often 30, 35 people who look after the players for the 3 hours they're at the training ground every day, and maybe one person or even nobody looking after them for the other 21 hours a day. So how does that work, and how does that make sense? So I think there's a real cultural shift in terms of what teams are looking at, but certainly I think this is it's an area that we're going to see a lot of growth in the next sort of 10, 15 years.
And just by way of kind of working examples, what sort of player care would you have given players, say, for example, at West Ham, Southampton?
Yeah, so what we try and do is we have sort of 3 different phases. We have the onboarding phase, which is basically trying to sort some key things. So housing, car, bank account, visas, phones, English lessons, and schools for kids. And once those 7 bits are sorted, they kind of are more self-sufficient. They're out the hotel, they can get around, they can start to speak the language. So then they move into the sort of the middle phase, the ongoing phase, which is much more, this has got a problem, flat tire, leak in the flat or something like that. But it can also be looking at education individually, whether it's financial education, social media, extra language lessons. I've done music lessons, but it could be, some players want to start a foundation or they want to do whatever. So you have that ongoing phase, and then you have the offboarding phase, which is trying to basically stop them relying on the club as quickly as possible, transfer them to the other club as well as possible, but also try and create an ambassador where football's such a small world where you want them to go, yeah, I had a great time at West Ham. And if someone calls them because they've been approached by West Ham, go, yeah, it was a great experience, really enjoyed it. So, I mean, the amount of things I've done, I always get asked, like, what's the craziest request you've ever had? And, getting a call on Christmas Eve for a bright pink and champagne coloured Christmas tree, which I had to deliver in about 6 hours, and did deliver. But I think I try not to judge people for their requests, because if it's important to them, it should be important to me. And I think the philosophy I've always had is like a no ... but, which is, no, maybe we can't do this, but here's a solution that's actually acceptable and legal and possible. Because if you say no, they're likely to go somewhere else that's going to rip them off. So I think there's a couple of different lessons in there.
And so you mentioned earlier that player care as a concept, but also player care kind of as a cost for a club is fairly new.
Yeah.
by that, are you sort of indicating that maybe clubs could do things better, or there's still a way to go?
Yeah, I think looking at the Premier League as an example, which is often seen as one of the better organised leagues or better resource leagues, 2 clubs have nobody doing player care and 9 clubs have 1 person doing it. So the majority of the league, it's either reliant on nobody or 1 single person who's got to be available 24 hours a day for 12 months a year. And if that person gets sick or that person has some problems or, is even dealing with something else, it leaves you very, very under-resourced. And there's so much riding on that 1 person that often you see burnouts really high in the industry. So absolutely, I think they could do it better. But I think that's kind of where my company comes in, is to try and help clubs work out what they should be doing. And it's not one size fits all. Different clubs have different needs, but also looking around the world. Europe's quite far behind on this as well. America's kind of a little bit further forward, but there's still a lot to be learned. And then, looking at other sports as well. So it's really an exciting time to be part of player care. Sure.
And then one thing I mentioned at the beginning, and you've already mentioned very, very much in passing, social media or player engagement on social media. Is there a sort of education piece in what you do, or are you involved in particularly for players at a young age in whether you yourself or bringing in experts to educate players on how to use social media and how to use that for positive or for commercial reasons?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the academy, there'll be definitely expert social media training for the young players. At the first team, it's a little bit different. It's more on sort of be careful what you post. But I think what I've found, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years, is just players are moving away from social media. A lot of them will have companies who kind of manage it for them, or I know a number of players who have literally no access to their accounts at all, don't read it, and it's posted on their behalf, quite generic sort of captions because they feel like they should have something, but actually the negatives far outweigh the positives, which I think is a shame. And where it's gone from being a nice way for the fans to access the players and vice versa, it's turned into quite toxic. It's basically abuse that can be delivered to your phone 24 hours a day in a lot of cases. And I remember sat next to a player on the bus on the way away from a game, and he'd had a stinker. I mean, one of the worst performances I'd seen in the Premier League. And his phone was just zzz, 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 and it was kill yourself, get out our club, you're a disgrace, etc., etc. And I said, why do you have your notifications on? And he was like, that's part of being a footballer. And I was like, it's not. You can accept a certain level of criticism, but that is beyond it, and that's vile. I haven't had any of my players be racially abused, but I'm sure it's happened and maybe they haven't reported it. But you're looking at all the negatives with social media nowadays. A lot of players like, why bother? Why put myself out there if I'm just going to have the negatives? So I think that's a shame, but I think it's the reality of where things are going, unfortunately.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting, and I think it's also possibly a good point at which to bring in Philip. Because if we're talking now about the toxicity of social media, maybe we'll come back later in the discussion and talk about the positives of social media and how brand building on social media can be a good thing for players. But I think given your work, Philip, and if we're talking about toxicity, actually, should we start about, just perhaps you could, by way of explanation, explain how Defuse potentially would be brought in if, say, one of Hugo's players is maybe encountering some particularly bad abuse or threats online?
Yes, we obviously operate with a number of different individuals and organisations, and so very often what happens is we're brought in at the point of crisis, and very often that's kind of too late, because once the genie's out of the bottle, it's quite difficult to put it back in again. So a lot of what we're doing is preventative, and so that's kind of where we choose to be. But we do get brought in, and we have been brought in, quite recently, with a number of different people who have been subjected to abuse. And what they generally, there's kind of 3 things really. One is they want to know, am I in danger? Actually, is there a genuine physical threat against me? Am I, is my family in danger, etc. And much of that is kind of counterintuitive in terms of people assume that that people that make threats and all that sort of stuff, you need to be worried about. In truth, in terms of public figures, generally, about 85-90% of the time, those people that make threats don't pose threats. Challenge is that there are clear kind of linguistic and behavioural indicators that signify someone actually does pose a genuine threat. The problem we have at the moment in terms of the football side is that the strategy that football is taking with the current sort of social media abuse, etc., is in my position, a kind of deeply flawed strategy, and one that I think, unfortunately, in many ways mirrors the pre-Joe Cox experience. And so when I went into Parliament post Joe Cox and started kind of investigating and reviewing what was going on, it was very similar parallels to what we're experiencing in football now, in that there was a number of high-profile people who had abuse and who had sometimes chosen to leave social media or operate differently. But generally speaking, it was hugely underreported. It was being dealt with poorly by people who had very good intentions but didn't really understand the complexity of what was happening and the risks to what they were doing. And so, the strategy that the football are taking at the moment, which tends to be trying to get a technical solution to block any abuse receiving the end user, if you like, is a flawed strategy, and one that actually has dangers attached to it. Because whilst you don't want the individuals to be abused and threatened, etc., you first and foremost need to understand that within those messages, there is a small percentage that will actually be genuinely worrying and concerning. And if you're just blocking all the messages, then actually you may miss that. Equally, you're going to miss escalation, behavioral escalation. So you're going to miss all the signs that actually there is a real issue here. And very much of what happens online is context driven. So, you'll get the obvious ones, which are, just blatantly racist, blatantly abusive and all that. And that's pretty simple to deal with, quite honestly. But despite all the criticisms of social media, etc., they're pretty good when it comes to the most extreme elements of it. The real challenge is where it's context driven. And so, if you are a professional footballer and you get a message which is blatantly abusive, you're not going to, it is what it is. But if you're getting messages such as, I know where your kids go to school, that's a lot more worrying. And of course, firstly, no keyword search is going to find that. And there's lots of parallels. So when you went into Parliament, all of a sudden you've been, these people that for years had been saying, there's no problem, suddenly we're coming out of the woodwork and we're talking about the abuse and the threats and everything else they were getting. So I've had conversations in the last week with fairly senior people at different league levels in UK football who've been saying exactly the same things. Oh, we don't really think we've got that problem. We're not hearing about these sort of things. When you try to have the conversation around, well, for start, most footballers won't even discuss it with each other or the dressing rooms or anyone else. It's just not a conversation you have. And I've spoken to a couple of professional footballers who say, there's no way in the world I'd bring this up in the changing room and talk to people. I'm never going to show any vulnerability and explain these sort of things. So I think football's got its head in the sand a little bit around the gravity of the issues they're dealing with.
I see you, sorry, just to break off there, Phil. I see you nodding, Hugo. Is that your experience as well with the players you work with? Yeah,
I think, the stuff that I've seen, the problem is that when they report something, it's normally a fairly lengthy form they've got to fill out. And then they get, someone wants to come meet with them and discuss it. And they're like, it's easier just to ignore it than it is to actually report it. And so therefore the authorities and the clubs don't really know the full scale of it, because you've got to put in like who you are, or sometimes it's anonymous, but sometimes it's who you are, and then a screenshot of the thing, what time it was, a link to the tweet, etc., etc. And they just can't be bothered. It's more effort to report things than it is just to leave them. And that's why I think Philip's right in the fact that, probably the authorities are a little bit naive to it, but also I don't really know how you would solve that problem, other than kind of having maybe a WhatsApp number you can just forward it on and just, here's something I've seen. But a lot of them would just be like, oh, it's going to be so much more faff than it's worth to make a big deal out of this, so I will just leave it. And then so a lot of it gets unreported or just left as is.
So then thinking that through, Philip, at what point does it become problematic? When it's repetitious, what point does the sort of penny drop with a player that actually it does need to be escalated and they need to bring you guys in to assist?
Well, in football, very rarely. I mean, we don't have a lot of involvement in football. I think one of the real challenges around football, and it's really been interesting for me since I've been brought into NFL, because this week, in actual fact, is the NFL Security Conference, which is this year happens to be virtual. And so I've been on that every day, and it's fascinating how far ahead they are of English football. I mean, they are absolutely superb. Totally understand it. I mean, yesterday we had a briefing by the head of the US Secret Service on kind of what the threat landscape is and all that sort of stuff. And they really understand it, really take it seriously. They understand the linguistic and behavioural issues. They've got a dedicated centre that looks at all of this 24 hours a day. So they look after the sport in a whole different way, whereas English football is totally fractured. And so it's very difficult to get any kind of consistency of reporting. But when we are brought in, it's about what do you want? Most people want to know, who is this person? Who is this individual that actually is doing this? And so one of the first things we're able to do is identify people quite reasonably quickly. Now, everyone talks about anonymity on social media, and that's a bit of a myth, because there's not that many people that are properly anonymous on social media. Most people we track, we find out who they are. We had a client in the US recently that came to us who's he works for sort of some of the biggest stars out there, was being targeted. We identified the person within 24 hours, date of birth, name, social security number, the whole works, delivered to his lawyers. And then we ended up actually engaging with contacts of ours through Facebook to get all, this profile taken down and everything. So there is this huge myth that everyone's anonymous on social media, and that's not true. Most of us have usernames because we can't use our own names for most places. Facebook, generally people use their own names, elsewhere they don't. But there are very few people that are absolutely anonymous. And those people who are genuinely anonymous, there are different mechanisms of how you might identify them. But again, a lot of people talk about IP addresses and all that sort of stuff. Bit of a misnomer, because you can turn your Wi-Fi off at home, turn it back on again 10 minutes later, and you've got a new IP address. So, I use a VPN. So, it's not quite as simple as that. But a lot of people want to know who it is, and particularly when we're dealing with some of the female celebrities and athletes we work with, because there is that fear element of that. Who is this person? And when I open my door, is everyone a threat, or who is it? I want to know who it is. But also being able to sit down with them and actually articulate why this is not a physical threat, why this person doesn't pose you any actual threat. And there's kind of a science behind it. It isn't just common sense and gut reaction. It's be able to kind of provide them with tangible reasons why we can say that quite accurately. And even if it's an anonymous threat, even if there's no name to it, whether we're using behavioral analysis or we're using linguistics, you can come quite quickly and tell someone whether there's a threat or not.
Can you give some real life kind of example? That's fascinating that you can tell from a written message, or presumably the frequency of the messages or the tone of the messages or what have you, whether it's a threat or not. What sort of examples could you give that?
Well, I can tell you of a very specific example where we stopped the next attack in Parliament, as an example. So the information that came into my office and then to me was an individual that was third party reported and had various markers around this individual's plan was to kidnap the MP, call in the police officer that had been investigating as well, kill them both, and then effectively commit suicide by a cop. That was his plan. And actually it was at quite an advanced stage. But within that, there are a number of different indicators that his planning was genuine. So when I had to phone up the head of terrorism and say, I've got a genuine attack planning here that you need to step into. And the obvious question was, how do you know that one's genuine against all the others that you get every single day? And we were dealing with hundreds. And it was because there were a number of different markers within that we could say, he has said this, he's done this. And there's kind of 8 behavioral markers, which no one has them all, but they'll have various of them. There were linguistic clues, such as he was using end of life language. So in terms of the suicide by cockpit, if someone is saying to you, for instance, on social media or other correspondence, things like, I'm at the end of my tether, or you give me no other option, or, you've put me into a corner now, those are indicators that you need to start taking this seriously, because what the person's actually saying is, I've got no other options. I've explored all the options and I find I have no other option now. And therefore I might now resort to violence. But equally, if someone is communicating to you via different means, if they're contacting you on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram, and they're emailing you and they're phoning and they're doing all sorts of other things, then that's another sort of sign that actually there's an escalation here. If they're approaching, if you're looking at fixated people have a desire for proximity, so they will make an approach. And there are numerous examples through history where people have been fundamentally attacked in the end, and when they track it back, they could track the person back to turning up at various different venues. So I was brought in about 18 months ago when one of the kind of global music icons with one name that when you say them, everyone knows who they are across the world, was doing this particular series of events. And they had a series of death threats came in anonymously. And so we were able to identify who the person was and their location. But we were also able to track the fact that they turned up at 3 different events and no one had noticed, because there was no debriefing of the security team. So when this person, who they just put down as some mad person turning up and a bit of a crazy, actually because they turned up at different events, there were clear warnings there. But a lot of security just kind of do an event, nothing happens, they move on. There's no debrief, there's no, anyone turn up today who we're worried about? Did you get any details? There was none of that. So we were able to identify that, and we were able to then, provide a kind of medical analysis of this person in terms of from one of our psychologists, and then feed that back to the team to say, this is the person, this is the image, this is where they are right now, this is the threat they're going to pose. The celebrity themselves had no idea this was all going on. This was just between us and the security person. We don't need to tell the celebrity or the professional or whatever else, because we're trying to minimize the anxiety and fear they experience. But unfortunately, so much is kind of mismanaged and misunderstood about it. And again, to Hugo's point around many of the players now having teams doing their social media, that's exactly the same with politicians. It's exactly how they operate. So people think they're communicating with the footballer, and they're not. And it came to light, a few weeks ago in football, didn't it, when the Tottenham goalkeepers team published a congratulatory message on a European game, which they end up losing. But the point is that sometimes those teams, because of their naivety and because of their desire to kind of almost be a PR machine, actually cause more trouble than they're worth. And they send out messages that attract problems. And the professional themselves often has no idea what's been communicated. And that raises all sorts of issues. But, I think football needs to understand that we don't want to get to having a Joe Cox in the football world before they start taking some of these issues more seriously.
That's to bring then Hugo kind of back in quickly and to also touch on what you just mentioned about the NFL. Hugo's already talked about player care being a relatively new thing in the context of English football, and there's still work to be done. And you're saying the NFL's now miles ahead of the Premier League in terms of how to deal with the sort of specific threats you've talked about. Presumably the NFL, we should learn from the NFL, or the governing bodies in football in the UK should learn from the NFL, and that in turn should feed back to the sort of work that Hugo's doing and feed back to the social media teams that the players are engaging.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? But the irony is, when you consider that the NFL have got a strategic relationship with Tottenham, as an example. So yeah. Tottenham is the most secure football stadium probably in the world, because the NFL's security standards are significantly higher than football. So therefore, Tottenham had to meet those standards to get the NFL contracts. And I know that when they come to Tottenham later on this year in October to play the games, I'll be managing a lot of that kind of investigation and intelligence, and a couple of colleagues of mine will be doing other bits, which will be head and shoulders above anything Spurs do. I've reached out to Spurs to say, look, let's have a conversation around this and how we can bed in some of the stuff we're doing for America. They're not interested. They're just not. I actually got a direct message back from Daniel Levy saying, thanks so much, we're quite comfortable with what we've got. And so there's this real, and one of the challenges is that within the UK football world, most people involved in security are there because they're experts in crowd control and, you know, managing football matches, not this type of genuine threat landscape where they have no real understanding of it at all.
Can I just interject here one moment, Julian, on that point?
Of course.
Sorry, Philip. Yeah, I don't mean to be alarmist, and people might be worried about some of the things they're hearing. But from my experience, yes, there are significant threats out there currently, and it could be growing. I mean, even last night, I heard on the news, someone I met at Celtic Football Club, Chief Executive Peter Lawwell, just had not one but 3 of his cars torched. And I think it caused damage to the garage as well, and the family are traumatized. So, you know, is that this type of individual we're thinking about, perhaps someone who generally dislikes the club and wants to have a go? I've had stories of blackmail, players who are being blackmailed. The list is endless. And I just sense that in the world is changing because of COVID, things might be moving into slightly more dangerous areas, and that we have to be more careful. That's my view.
It's interesting because I think it was yesterday they brought up the issue of the crowd disturbance issues around Man United for the recent Man United Liverpool game. So this is the NFL in America talking about that, and just kind of slightly shocked that ever got as far as it did, because it would certainly never, you know, the way in which they operate in the US is totally different. Now, there are obviously reasons why, because they have certain different risks over there, etc. But interestingly, when they come to the UK, they will act exactly the same. Even though there's no firearm threat, all those sort of things are different. There's some real interesting things that they do, which I can tell you, having spoken to various senior people at, you know, various organisations in football, that it's not even on their radar.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in Richard now, who's been sitting very patiently, because although I don't think this particular discussion necessarily will be talking about physical threat and the coming from kind of social media and what have you, we have had a theme running through this session around kind of reputation management. And to start with, Richard, I wonder if you could maybe just explain what sort of work you get involved in from a reputation management perspective, because I know it's not just social media, right?
There you go. Yeah, no, reputation management's an incredibly broad church. From the urgent call I had a few weeks ago from a current member of Parliament who'd had a text from a journalist on a Friday afternoon. They like Friday afternoons, journalists. To suggest that something would appear in the Sunday Times about this individual. And so, you know, it's sort of slightly disruptive. You do end up sort of speaking with barristers whilst you're trying to cook it, etc. But, you know, that sort of call is something that this particular individual knew what to do, got on, and we engaged with the particular newspaper and convinced them that what they're about to do wasn't right in any event. And then also, you know, which I'll come on to, engaged on a number of levels with them about, even if they were going to run a story, it was not going to be on Sunday because there wasn't enough time, etc. But you get that to also more prolonged things where you get organisations or individuals where there's been maybe some historical or previous issues or long-running issues which suddenly become current. And again, they get contact from journalists to say, you know, we're thinking of running a story. We've got some questions. And, you know, those things can harm somebody. And you've seen it yourselves, you know, somebody's done something when they're 17, 18, 19, said things. And, you know, newspapers obviously exist forever in old school stores before the internet occurred. But now this is all so easily accessible and is almost there forever. And these things come back and harm. So we often get contacted by people in relation to things like that. And then, you know, and there also are the issues where somebody may have misbehaved or done something that isn't going to be helpful, fair, and that's about to come out. Can we help? Down to more straightforward of, I am getting abused on the internet. What can we do about it? And to be fair, you know, a lot of this stuff is often think far more light, perhaps, or again relating to something in their personal life, and we help with that. So it's quite varied. It's quite interesting. It's often urgent. Often you get people calling up who are quite stressed, because of course the effect of some of these approaches on their life can just be absolutely devastating. You know, lose your family, lose your job. You know, it takes one comment. So yeah, there's some of the areas we get involved in. So it is quite exciting at times. But also
looking at the newspaper example, then,
yeah.
What's the kind of, if there is a sort of textbook chronology of events, to journalist calls what, footballer's agent or footballer directly?
It really varies, and sometimes it varies on the newspaper, whether they're freelance, whether they're retained, what sort of piece the journalist is looking at. Is it a long journalism piece, which is allegedly fashionable now, so they'll do a lot of research, or is it, you know, a piece that they want an instant buzz on Saturday because there's something else broken? But you know, it can be from doorstepping. It's usually now via email, text, letter, and it is often directly to the individual, and it can be quite subtle. And part of it is the journalist actually wants to try and appear unthreatening and try and engage with whoever they're talking about, because actually what tends to happen a lot of the time is the individual or entity starts to engage with the journalist and effectively writes the journalist's story. So you get a load of things which are fishing, some of which have some truth, some are rubbish, and then without some help, somebody responds to it, and actually they've just, by saying, no, I didn't do that, I did this, you've just given the story and written it to the journalist, and he's like happy, and you know, he's ticked his boxes, because there obviously is the concepts of defamation, which, you know, is where you're in effect harming somebody's reputation in the eyes of right-thinking people. And also, contrary to popular belief, we do actually have a right to privacy, which isn't necessarily privacy law, but breach of confidence. And so there are things you can protect about, you know, yourself on a legal basis. And the better, you know, news outlets do sign up to sort of IPSO code, which is a code for editors, which it's quite a long document now. It's about 140, 150 pages worth of guidance to reporters and editors and publishers as to how they should behave with certain news elements. So from, you know, dealing with things like privacy, etc., it also starts out with accuracy. So what steps should journalists take to ensure that what they're writing is accurate? So the journalist needs to investigate properly, keep notes. Doesn't necessarily have to tell you their sources, but they need to know their sources, so it can be checked out internally, and also give you a right to reply, not just to the facts, but also to the general tenor of the story. You don't have to see the story, you don't get an editorial choice where you can get your pen out and start marking it up, but you should get a position where a journalist says, we're thinking of running a piece, it's going to be in this direction, and making these allegations or suggestions, here's some facts, what are your comments? And they do that, sorry, go on.
No, after you.
And they do that because they want to try and avail themselves of some sort of privilege, a defence to any defamation claim, that what they've got out is in the public interest, honestly held, and they have put the story to you. So there's an approach by journalists they're trying to do when they contact you. So what you shouldn't do is ignore them without advice, because that makes their life quite easy.
So it's not ignored. Your advice is pick up the phone to you and help from a legal perspective. Do you also, is there a team of people that are there then to respond? Presumably you work with PR agencies. Would you work with, say, you know, likes of Hugo or player liaison at a club to also put the club's perspective on, or indeed get the club involved?
It varies across the piece, and I think we've said before, you know, it's a life cycle. You know, at various points in people's careers, they go from being, you know, professionals, athletes, or, you know, singers, whatever, into just people who are media stars, whatever they do. So various points have different support networks around them. But one thing, you know, I'd always say is if you have a support network, be it a club that's progressive or an agent or a manager, whatever, get them involved, straight away. Unless, of course, it's some way some sort of talk that your agent's stealing your money or something. But using common sense, get involved, because a support network is important. Because a lot of people, Hugo said it before, it's thrown out into the world from one environment to sometime with a lot of money, fame, incredibly quickly. It's not a gradual process. And I learned to be a doctor, and different exposures, and suddenly there's this pressure on you. A journalist calls from the Times, charming. It's very easy to be exploited. So if you have a support network, that's great. But the best bit is where you can look at things proactively, and somebody says to you before these things happen, just have a think. Here's some training, and what Hugo's talking about is perfect. And also, what some agents as well are very helpful and protective of their stars and assets to help them look before what might come down the track. But if you are surprised by something, speak to somebody to help, because of course anybody who gets an approach like this, you go into fight or flight mode. The worst thing you can do is an off the cuff response, which is ill thought out. You don't know what they know. You also need to make sure you protect your position, so that if it is needs be, it might be the police need to involve. This could be threatening, it could be harassment, it could be somebody, where there's sinister elements that your family's safety might be threatened. It might not just be somebody, suggesting unpleasant things about what they're going to reveal about your private life. You need to examine these things early and quickly, and there's a small window, and especially where, it could lead to something serious. And particularly, as Philip said, some very concerning things out there these days.
From a legal perspective, dealing with concerning things out there that are posted on social media, because on the one hand, fine, you've had a career of experience dealing with the likes of journalists from the Sun or Sunday Times or whatever. How's that different now, engaging, say, for example, with Facebook or Twitter or any of the other platforms?
Obviously, the media feels that it has something to answer to, ultimately, no matter what they think, which is the legal system and defamation, and privacy activity, and also an independent code. And therefore, an editor will engage. And so we often write copy correspondence to journalists to their legal department. Facebook is beyond the law as far as they're concerned, in my experience, and they'll do what they want. And there's things are easy to get things where there's race, violence put in, but they're not really interested in taking down things which you and I would look at and say that's just inappropriate. No, you can get it taken down. You get the courts involved, but Facebook still stand behind this freedom of speech, etc. It's their interpretation, but often run through robots, computers, and it's not a quick or easy process. Twitter is just the same. Trustpilot, all of these things, which can be very, very harmful, and they're very hard to penetrate. They have departments which you can speak to. Sometimes you can look out, but very difficult. And quite often you do have to end up going to court to get an order, to get things taken down, which can be harmful.
Philip, Hugo, is that your kind of experience as well, in terms of trying to get the platforms to delete stuff or to deal with issues?
I think from my point of view, we often work with our content teams, so they have the direct link, but I've had players who've been locked out their account for days or weeks because it's hard to get a response out of the social media guys at those, to even get hold of a single person and then get them to action it, and then they want the passport copy and they want this and they want that, and it can be very frustrating for a player. Especially, we had a player who was hacked on a game day by someone. Basically, it was like, if you sign as a thank you for all your support, I'm giving everyone free Bitcoin. Please sign in here with your bank details and it'll be sent to your account. And we had like 150 people who did that. And that was the day of a game. And it took us like hours to get it back. So it can be really, really difficult. So yeah, it's not easy.
I mean, I think going into sort of the football world again, what we did in Parliament, what really worked well is we built a relationship with Facebook and Twitter. And so everything that was going so we had a dedicated, for instance, they've got a complaints bit. We had a dedicated one set up for Parliament. We had, still have direct contact with kind of fairly senior people within Twitter and Facebook. So if there was an issue, we would be able to phone them up direct and say, look, come on, let's have some common sense here, or what have you. Very often, actually, what would happen is the UK people might say, yeah, okay, we see that. And the US would be the ones that would say, no, we're overriding that. We're not taking it down. But I think where football might learn by that is, is building, rather than kind of going to battle with them, is kind of building those relationships. And rather than having, every single football club and Kick It Out and the Premier League all having their own mailboxes, what we had was a single point of contact, so that we learned their processes, so that we were able to say to politicians sometimes, there's no point even worrying about that. That's never going to come down. But other times we're able to sort of go into battle and actually have that personal conversation with a contact at Facebook or Twitter. But also understanding, for instance, that how Twitter works. So Twitter has a policy where if there's an investigation that's officially started, unless you do it in a certain way, Twitter will automatically tell the person that's being investigated they're under investigation. So of course what they'll do is delete the post and delete their profile. And Twitter will tell you the minute that's deleted, they'll never recover it, and they won't tell you anything. Now you can override that, but unless you know what you're doing, you're gonna lose that evidence. And so that's why I think, rather than going into battle all the time with them, it's good to build those relationships. It's good to have a single point of contact, and it's also, you need to understand what their policies are. And as Richard said, that they're very heavy on freedom of speech. That's where they come from. These are all kind of San Francisco-based companies. That's what their business model is. But equally, they're also dealing with a huge amount of abuse that comes into UK football, for instance, is coming from overseas. So there's a whole context issues about, it may mean something really insulting here, but it may not do in that country. So where's the line really? But ultimately, I think I pick up the phone to people. That's how I got that account cancelled at Instagram, is by picking up the phone to my contact at Facebook, even though Instagram in the US had said no, we're not dealing with it, and having that conversation, saying, look, come on, this is breaching your regulation. They're using bots, etc., etc., etc. And they came back to me in a couple of days and said, yep, you're right. But go back to Richard's point about the time delay. Really, this is, again, one of the issues around where I think football's getting it wrong, is that you need to respond to this stuff instantly. And there's no point going back to it in 3 or 6 weeks' time to try and deal with it, because actually most people have moved on. It's been forgotten. And all you're then doing is kind of regurgitating it and giving this person a wider audience. And too often we see footballers screenshotting it and posting it to their network. You shouldn't be doing that. That's just nonsense. It's broadcasting this nobody, opening up to your entire network. So I don't know who's kind of giving them that sort of advice or what have you, but it's just really poor advice to be doing that.
I think sorry.
No.
The point about grouping together, said, go to an organisation, strengthening numbers and also coordinated response. It's by far the best. And as you say, there's been many regulators that have been charged with regulating an area and engaged with whatever they're regulating. And by far the most effective regulator has often been not the one that shouts, rants and saber rattles at the organisation, but actually works with and gets involved and understands both sides. And sometimes people say, oh, they're not that effective. When you look at the actual results, they are effective in a more subtle way. And I think, so you're right, taking football particularly, it's a big organisation, it's a massive business, it's global. There's a lot at stake. It's money, part of its money-making bits are undoubtedly the people who keep the football round. And you've got to look after those assets. And I think so much more work can be done to proactively help, and obviously via the clubs with this sort of stuff, dealing with the internet and Facebook, etc., in a far better way. There is definitely work to be done on that. I agree fully with Philip. Absolutely, it's not that sort of work for lawyers. We do it, but that it's not often was the most effective. There's still a lot for us to do in relation to the more significant issues relating to people's privacy and articles. Or where there's a picture being taken over a wall, which still happens of somebody doing something that perhaps their partner might not want them to see, or taking pictures of their children. That's the sort of stuff where yeah, there's strong work we can do. But the other side of it, it was more that the organisation of whatever sport or entity can do.
I'm very conscious of time. Oh, sorry, Joe. I'm conscious of time ticking. And before you wind it up, Julian, and finish off, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, because we are literally in the last few minutes of this show. I must say, absolutely fascinating. We haven't had any questions come in, and to be honest with you, I think people are too fascinated to put the questions in, because they're just enthralled, as I have been. This will help people in all sorts of ways. And to be honest with you, I'm in the process of signing up a new series of shows with a series of artists and individuals I work with or know. And this will be a series of what I call JLR interviews, a person that is well known. I've just had the sign up from 4 of them, and they will all be talking, I'm sure, in some way about these sorts of issues we've just covered. I don't know if you've heard of Martin Afire, who was a famous rugby player. Chariots, as he was known, has just agreed. Wayne Barnes, is that a name that rings bells? He's perhaps the most famous rugby international referee. Patti Boulay is a name that, if you're in the world of singing and pop music. And then finally, Hugo, yesterday I got an email from one of your favourites and mine, Matthew Letitia, will be doing the interview. So anyway, thank you all again. I'll hand over to Julian to sort of tie up the loose ends. Thanks, Julian.
Yeah, well, in terms of tying up the loose ends, I'm also going to underline kind of how grateful we are for all of your contributions. I think that's been really interesting, coming at things from slightly different angles, whether from the player perspective, whether from the perspective of dealing with some very serious threats, or whether dealing with it from the legal perspective. And at the end, we all kind of seem to have reached the same sort of position, which is there's an education piece here, which for English football, we can do things better. We can learn from the likes of the NFL. And there's a bit of a way to go. And I guess slightly saddened by your comment, Hugo, that players are now kind of switching off social media entirely. Because I think social media ultimately still does represent an opportunity to build brand, to raise commercial revenue, can be used for positive. You look at Marcus Rashford and what he's done on social media over the summer. Yeah, so obviously work to do. But
Julian, can I interrupt you? Sorry, I have a question that's come in suddenly. Question to Hugo, actually. What are the key skills, Hugo, according to you, in order to follow the pathway of player care? What are the key skills?
I think, personally, you need to be charismatic, organised, transparent, honest. But it's not as easy as just having those skills and then getting a job. I think it's a hugely competitive industry. Each job gets thousands of applications because there's a fairly low barrier in terms of skills, qualifications needed. So yeah, not an easy one really, but in terms of personal skills, the ones I mentioned, I'd recommend as kind of basic essentials, really.
Okay, thank you.
Very good. So should we wrap things up there then, Jose?
Yes, and I've just had a thank you from someone else. Thank you for the fascinating insights into this complex subject area. Thank you for the series. So thank you all. Thank you for the attending, and hopefully we'll see you soon in perhaps a different show, different series. My thanks to Mills Reeve for hosting this event. Thank you, sirs. My thanks also to our special panelist guests, Philip Grindell from Defuse Global and Hugo Schechter from Player Group, looking after their clients in a very professional way. Thank you all.